Thank you very much, Sue-Ann. I can't help feeling that anything I could say would be anticlimactic after that intro, so I may cut it short. Bye, Ben. Somewhere in Philadelphia there's a room that doesn't have a portrait of Franklin in it, but I haven't seen it yet. So I'd like to add my own thanks, of course, to both the APS and to the Penn Humanities Forum for the invitation to be here. Many thanks to you all for coming. It would have been a strange evening for me if no one had showed up, so I appreciate that. And a particular thanks to my parents-in-law who are very generously housing me this week, despite the fact that I showed up without their beloved grandchildren, so my thanks to them as well. So I want to talk this evening about pictures like this, in part. Pictures of excitement and adventure of little wooden ships getting trapped in the pack ice of Antarctica. This is HMS Erebus. And the active volcano you can see smouldering in the background is named after this ship. This was Joseph Hooker's ship, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him and the voyage as we go on. And of course, as our theme is connections, what I want to do is draw together some links between these topics, which I've put up here. Let me introduce one or two of the characters in my story. Charles Darwin, obviously, well-known figure. Joseph Hooker, a little less well-known, but I hope you feel you know him a little better by the end of the evening. One of the things that connects them, and I'm not sure whether it's clear from Sue-Ann's introduction, but what I really do as a historian is I look at the question of what scientists do all day, what they actually do when they're doing science. What is it that goes on, as it were, behind the scenes of books like The Origin of Species? How do they get made? What makes them possible? And those are some of the things that I want to look at this evening. What connects all these things? In a word, letters connect them. These are examples of letters between Darwin and Hooker. I'll transcribe the ones that I read to you so you haven't got to deal with this unbelievably vile 19th century handwriting. I've been through a lot of these and it's painful business. Letter writing is perhaps the single most important scientific practice that makes the world of Victorian science possible. It makes Darwin's work possible. And I'll try and use the letters to make connections between a number of different themes. Obviously, they're used to link Darwin and Hooker and their correspondence. Scientific information and specimens and intelligence flows around the world in the form of letters. The letters also give us some insights into the private lives of men like Darwin and Hooker, and they turn out not to be entirely private. They overlap into the public world of science as well. And finally, of course, I think the letters are going to help us see some connections between science and empire. And empire forms, I think, the essential backdrop to understanding 19th century science and to understanding what Darwin did and how he was able to do it. So let me start with Joseph Dalton Hooker. You can see his dates up there. He was about my age when this picture was drawn, close to 50. And he complained that the artist had made him look a very lackadaisical young man. He was a traveller, an explorer, and a plant collector. He would eventually become deputy director of Britain's Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew during this period, 1855 to 65. In 65, his father, William Jackson Hooker, who was the director, died, and Hooker inherited his position, became director after him. Hooker is known, if he's known at all, for the fact that he was a very close friend of Darwin's. There are, in Cambridge, 14,500 surviving letters to and from Darwin, and they're in the process of being published. Of those letters, about 1,300 are between Hooker and Darwin, so they are by far the largest group of letters. Far more letters to Darwin than anyone else in Hooker's correspondence, far more letters to Hooker than anyone else in Darwin's. So it's a very important friendship. And partly as a result of that friendship, Hooker becomes the very first man of science to come out publicly in support of Darwin and his theories when Darwin eventually publishes them 150 years ago. Well, 150 years next Monday, to be precise. So he's a key figure in Darwin's story, but his own story is a little less well known. And what I want to do to begin with is tell you a little bit about him and who he was. He's the son of this man, William Jackson Hooker, who, as you can see, was a brewer until 1820. Unfortunately, William made the bad mistake of selling the little bit of land he'd inherited and investing it in his father-in-law's brewery, which he did just at the end of the Napoleonic Wars when there was a huge economic depression in Britain, and the price of beer and bread fell rather sharply for a while. So this turned out to be a poor investment at the time. And so he decided to take his hobby, which was natural history, and turn it into a paying profession. And he became Regius Professor of Botany at the University of Glasgow. Despite the fact that he'd never heard, much less given a university lecture at this point, he had enough influential friends to get him the job. Now, Regius Professor of Botany sounds quite impressive, sounds like rather a good job. It really wasn't. Hooker would actually stand at the door of the lecture theatre in a theatre like this and collect fees from his students as they came in to pay his way. And what the people he was teaching were medical students. And they weren't just medical students are, of course, by definition, the lowest of the low. But these ones were even lower because they were training to be apothecaries. They were actually going to engage in trade and sell medicines. That's why they were learning about plants. Plants were the main source of medications at the time. So it was not a prestigious job at all. And I think Joseph Hooker's career is somewhat shaped by his sense of a kind of inferiority about botany as a science and its place relative to the other sciences. Joseph does a medical degree at Glasgow University alongside his father, and then, as a newly qualified assistant naval surgeon, sets forth on his first voyage off to the Antarctic as assistant surgeon aboard HMS Erebus, accompanied here by its sister ship, the Terror. And they're going to be gone for 4 years. He's 22 when he sets sail. As a boy, he'd always loved traveller's tales. He'd loved reading about adventure, and this picture from Captain Cook's account of his voyage to the Pacific was one that particularly stayed with Joseph. He recalls sitting on his grandfather's knee, reading Cook's travels, and Hooker remembers thinking that I should be the happiest boy alive if ever I would see that wonderful arched rock and knock penguins on the head. He went off on his voyage commanded by this man, James Clark Ross. Ross was known as the most handsome man in the Royal Navy. Certainly, this is his official portrait, which he paid for, commissioned and approved. He was certainly the most vain man in the British Navy, I would think. And when Hooker met him with a view to joining the expedition, he was, as I mentioned, just newly qualified, so it was by no means assured he would get the job. Ross told him that he wanted such a person as Mr. Darwin to be the botanist to the expedition. Hooker was rather put out by this, and he wrote to his father, "What was Mr. Darwin before he went out? He, I dare say, knew his subject better than I do now. But did the world know him? The voyage with Fitzroy, the captain of the Beagle, was the making of him, as I hoped this expedition would me." Despite being somewhat put out by not being the official naturalist, he was given the slightly inferior position of expedition's botanist, swallowed his pride, and set sail. Darwin's example and the use that Ross had made of it in the interview would have hit Hooker particularly hard, because he couldn't have known this, but Darwin was actually already a hero for Hooker. Because of his fondness for traveller's tales, a friend of the family had actually given young Joseph an advance proof copy of the Journal of Researches, the book we now know as The Voyage of the Beagle. And Joseph actually remembers that he slept with it under his pillow so that every morning he could read it before he had to start work on his medical studies. And he would later write that he felt rather overwhelmed by the variety of acquirements, mental and physical, required in a naturalist who should follow in Darwin's footsteps. Now, Darwin is already an important hero, an important example to Hooker. And of course, as Hooker said in that previous quote, what was Darwin before he went out? A rather feckless young man of no fixed ambitions. There were no obvious ways to make a career in science at this time. And travelling, going abroad on a ship, collecting natural history specimens and then publishing the results was one of the few ways that you could become a recognised man of science in natural history. So Hooker sets off, and this picture, which illustrates a famous episode on the voyage, the two ships get separated in the fog in the Antarctic, and the Erebus finds itself between two icebergs that are moving together. This is not a comfortable situation to be in a wooden sailing ship. They put on all the sail they can, head down this diminishing canyon as fast as they can, pop out the other end just before the icebergs hit each other, and find the Erebus, the Terror waiting for them on the other side, having sensibly gone round the iceberg. This is a seriously dangerous way to make a career. I mean, graduate school is a really cushy job by comparison. So it took no small degree of courage and a very large degree of commitment to follow this path to become a scientific gentleman. The great attraction of the voyage, as Hooker would stress to his father, is that no future botanist will probably ever visit the countries whither I am going, and that is the great attraction. The chance to go to virtually unknown countries and collect unknown plants. Now, of course, Antarctica is not known for its plant life, and the main purpose of the voyage was not, of course, botany. This is a chart, the official chart of the voyage. You'll notice actually Antarctica is rather conspicuous by its absence in this chart. They didn't actually know it was a continent when they set off. They hoped they could sail to the South Pole. They hoped it was just going to be pack ice there. And they gradually begin to map the outlines of the continent during this voyage. But of course, although the ships have specially strengthened hulls, and although they actually have furnaces on board to keep them warm, no wooden ship could withstand an Antarctic winter. So each year, as the ice closed in and the winter began, the ships would retreat, north, ahead of the Antarctic Circle, and they would repair the ships, resupply them, give everybody a chance to take a break from shipboard life. They would go to places like the Falkland Islands, off the coast of South America, to New Zealand, Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania as it's now known, and they also went to Kerguelen's Land. That's the place where Cook's sailors were pictured in the first thing. This is the picture of Erebus and Terror tied up in the same bay where Cook had been a generation earlier. And here, you'll be delighted to know, Hooker finally got to gratify his murderous desires towards the penguins. So apparently they're very good eating when you've been at sea for a long time. And of course, it's during these visits away from the Antarctic Circle to these countries around the Antarctic Circle that Hooker really begins to collect the plants of the Southern Hemisphere and starts to think about the relationships between them. One of the things that botany really doesn't have at this stage, that natural history doesn't have, are anything that looks like scientific laws. And the prestigious sciences, astronomy, physics, chemistry, even geology, are beginning to acquire laws. And that is raising them in prestige, in status, and of course they're beginning to be much better rewarded. And one of the things that Hooker is doing as he travels is thinking about making a global survey, of putting together a picture of the whole vegetation to try and understand why things grow where they grow, what has actually determined the patterns of plant geography as it was known at the time, and whether we could discern the laws that govern where plants grow and why they grow. And of course, the question of what he was going to do when he got back was much on his mind. As the ships head back to England, he writes to his father, "I am not independent and must not be too proud. If I cannot be a naturalist with a fortune, I must not be too vain to take honourable compensation for my trouble." And it's very clear from this quote, I think, that being a naturalist with a fortune would certainly have been his first choice. This is the kind of person he probably would have liked to have been. This is Sir Joseph Banks, who went with Cook on that earlier voyage. And of course, Banks was extremely wealthy. He didn't need government grants or patronage. He owned most of Lincolnshire. And so he actually paid to go on Cook's voyage. He actually provided all the equipment, the scientific personnel, on a very lavish scale. A contemporary observed that no people had ever gone to sea better equipped for the purposes of natural history, all thanks to Banks's money. And it's worth remembering that Charles Darwin is in many ways much more like Banks than he is like Hooker, precisely because he's got money. He's a wealthy landowner. He inherits money from his father, a naturalist. The money he inherits, his father was a wealthy doctor. This is back in the days when you could be a wealthy doctor in Britain, obviously. Socialised medicine has put a stop to that. But you're probably familiar with the concept of wealthy doctors on this side of the Atlantic. He leaves money to his son, he leaves land to his son, and Charles turns that into a considerable fortune by investing, and investing in the railways particularly, the boom industry of the time. So by the time Darwin dies, his fortune, in today's terms, is worth about 10 or 12 million pounds. So he is substantially rich by the end of his life, thanks to these investments. He never has to work at all in his life for money. And that puts him in a very different category to Joseph Hooker, who in many ways would have liked to have been more like Darwin, more like Banks, but was left with the necessity of earning a living. So let's take a little look at Darwin. Of course, it's important to remember that long before he was a bearded sage, he was, as I described him before, a rather feckless young man. It wasn't at all clear what he was actually going to do with his life. His father famously complained on one occasion that he cared only for shooting and rat-catching and would be a disgrace to his family. There are no formal qualifications in science, in natural history or any of the sciences available at English universities at this time. The best you could do was to go to Scotland and do a medical degree. And that's what Charles did. He was sent off with his brother to go where his father and grandfather had been before him, to Edinburgh University. Very advanced medical training, up-to-date French ideas, the kind of thing that was not taught south of the border. Unfortunately, whereas Joseph Hooker a few years later would do a similar degree at Glasgow and enjoy it very much and become a doctor, Charles didn't take to medical studies at all. And you get a sense of why from this contemporary cartoon by James Gilroy. This is, of course, the age before anaesthetics. And the trick to performing a successful amputation was to do it as fast as possible and hope that the shock and loss of blood didn't kill the patient. And Darwin recalls seeing two very bad operations, one on a child, he writes in his recollections of his life, that led him to run screaming from the operating theatre, and he never went back to medical studies. His father, Dr. Robert Darwin, is getting a little fed up with these changes of career and so on. So he does what you do with any, aimless younger son who doesn't seem to have any particular direction or interests. You send him to Cambridge. Christ's College, Cambridge. This is where Darwin went. That's what it looked like in his day. It looks exactly like that now. Those two Donish figures are probably still finishing that conversation. Nothing changed in Cambridge. By comparison with Edinburgh, a very conservative place. Mostly what they taught was theology. And Darwin was in fact training for the priesthood. The idea was he was going to be a country clergyman, an Anglican vicar who would give a sermon a week and spend the rest of his time in the hedgerows collecting beetles and pursuing his passion for natural history. That was a career, of course, which didn't turn out quite the way that he'd envisaged. And it didn't turn out because of another ship, HMS Beagle. Darwin gets the offer, because he has well-connected friends, to accompany the Beagle on this trip around the world. An extraordinary opportunity for a young man who, by his own admission, was not a finished naturalist by any stretch at this stage. How did Darwin get the job? Why was he suitable? Mostly because he was a gentleman. He had good table manners. The captain of the ship, Robert Fitzroy, was worried that he might go mad during the voyage. And he had good reason to worry. His uncle, Viscount Castlereagh, had killed himself, slit his throat, and it was widely believed that madness ran in families. And the previous captain of the Beagle on the previous voyage to South America, Pringle Stokes, had shot himself in the head and survived for more than 2 weeks afterwards. The loneliness of being a ship's captain really was enough to drive you crazy, because the way you kept order on a British Navy ship was by terrorising everybody on board, including the other officers. You couldn't have had friends even if anybody had wanted to be your friend. And what Fitzroy really wanted was a companion who was going to sit and dine with him every evening and keep him company and stop him going round the bend. So Darwin gets this extraordinary opportunity. But it's very important to remember, of course, the other thing that makes it possible for Darwin is that his father can pay for him to go. And he pays all his expenses, including the cost of a servant for most of the voyage. So he's got the money, he's got the table manners, he's got the connections in Cambridge that allow him to join this voyage. But the Beagle is not sailing for scientific purposes primarily, not for natural history purposes anyway. This is the official chart of the Galapagos Islands, which of course we associate now entirely with Darwin and with evolution. This is Fitzroy's Admiralty chart, and what the Beagle is actually doing is map making. That is its primary purpose. The countries of South America, where they spend most of their 5 years, have only recently become independent of Spanish and Portuguese imperial rule. There is a great new market for British goods opening up here, and having accurate charts of all the harbours and coastlines, the rocks, the shoals, is going to allow the British to exploit those opportunities much more successfully than any of their competitors. So there's a very clear, very important imperial mission behind the Beagle's voyage. And without that imperial mission, Darwin couldn't have gone. I mean, his dad had money, but he couldn't have bought him his own ship and equipped it. Even banks didn't do that. The king paid for the ship. So it makes it possible for Darwin to do what he's doing. This is his geological map of South America. Again, this is a printed map. The kind of thing, it's not one of the Beagle's charts, but it's the kind of thing that they were helping to make. And Darwin has hand-coloured it to show the rock formations of the time. Darwin is preeminently a geologist at this stage in his career. And geology is a science that's very important to the British. It's very important because Britain is the first industrial nation. And that industrial revolution has been built on coal and iron, of which Britain has plentiful supplies. But by the beginning of the 19th century, they're already wondering how long the supplies are going to last and where they're going to find more. So the business of mapping the rocks of the world and finding where new resources can be found to be mined and exploited becomes a very important part of Britain's industrialization and of its imperial ventures. And Darwin is at the heart of that project. And exactly the same is true of Hooker. On a later expedition after the first one, he goes to India, to Sikkim in the Nepal Himalayas, and he produces the first part of a projected flora of India. And he includes this map. I don't know whether you can just make out, it's divided by red lines into botanical provinces. And Hooker produces this for the use of future collectors so that they can give accurate locations as to where everything has been collected. This is part of the scheme that I mentioned before of mapping the distribution of plants across the earth so as to understand the laws that govern what grows where. Now, why would you care? What does it matter what grows where? Well, of course, what we have to remember is that the British Empire is built above all on one thing. And what is that? Tea. Hot, strong tea is what made Britain no. This is partly literally true, of course, because the British Navy is made of plants, of rope and hemp and cotton and timber. And more or less everything they carry in terms of the products that are traded across the empire is made of plants too. Tea, opium, coffee, spices, dyes, medicinal plants, the list goes on and on and on. Plants are of crucial economic importance to the British. So you need to map what grows where, partly so that you'll be able to predict and look for new resources. This is one of the things the geologists have done with their maps, has successfully predicted that gold will be found in Australia. You just imagine how well rewarded geology as a science becomes once they can do that. And Hooker has his eyes on a similar kind of prize. If we can figure out why plants grow where they are, maybe we can find another valuable crop, something as valuable as tea, which has been introduced into India by the British for economic purposes. And that, of course, is the other part of the equation. Once you've found something valuable, maybe you can transplant it from wherever it is now to somewhere that's under British rule, where it can be grown and exploited much more profitably. You may know that all those rubber trees that grow all over Malaysia, what is now Malaysia and Indonesia, they're not indigenous to that part of the world at all. The scientific name of the rubber tree is Hevea brasiliensis. And those trees are all descended from trees that were stolen from Brazil against the express wishes of the Portuguese and Brazilian governments by collectors working for Kew, who used the network of botanic gardens around the British Empire to move those plants to British colonies where they could be exploited by coolie labour. So this map-making business is of crucial significance to Hooker's career. One of the things that he does wherever he goes is collect samples of plant-based products that have economic importance. This is a brick of tea, which is now kept in a vault underneath Kew, part of what they call the Economic Botany Collection. I don't have a photo, but next to it is a huge block of raw opium, along with the pipes and everything that you use to smoke it and so on, all collected by Hooker for purely scientific research purposes, of course. And this, of course, is India rubber. Rubber is a crucially important commodity to the British because it's the insulator that's used for the submarine telegraph network. The telegraph network which links the British Empire allows them to communicate rapidly, and which the British, in all seriousness, argue is going to ensure that, unlike all the great empires of the past, unlike Alexander the Great's empire, the Roman Empire, and so on, the British Empire will last forever because we have the telegraph, because we have instant communication. It's never going to fall apart. Rubber to insulate those cables, there's no telegraph network. I want to talk a little bit about Kew and what it was doing. I'm sure many of you have been there and have seen pictures like this, the beautiful glass houses, the lovely flower beds and so on. This is a very small part of what Kew was doing. The really important part is here. This is the Herbarium wing, built under Hooker's direction in the 19th century, and this is where their specimens of dried plants are kept. This is a library of pressed dried plants. There are about, nobody actually knows exactly how many specimens there are. There are at least 7 million in the Kew Herbarium. It's one of the largest in the world. Close up, this is what a herbarium looks like. This one is actually the one at the British Museum. These are the plants that Joseph Banks collected on Captain Cook's voyage. This is what's called a type specimen, the original first named specimen of the species Banksia serrata, named in honour of Sir Joseph Banks. And here On these bits of paper, in these drawers, in these cabinets, is the entire world of plant, the classification of plants embodied in a filing cabinet. Each species has a sheet to itself. The card folder is a genus. So the Banksias all go, Serrata is one sheet in a folder called Banksia. Those go into a cabinet at the back called Proteaceae, which is the family to which it belongs, and so on. The order of nature, the classification which allows you to identify plants, to map their distribution, to understand how and where they grow, is built entirely on having enough bits of paper like this, enough dried plants. So then what we need to think about, this is what they look like when they come in. This is a specimen of Eucalyptus gunnii from Tasmania, collected by Hooker's friend Ronald Campbell Gunn when they were collecting together in Tasmania in the 1840s when the Erebus was there. The species is named by Hooker in honour of his friend. This is the way it looks once it's been described and published and illustrated in one of Hooker's books, The Flora of Tasmania. And the books, this is the title from which I took the earlier picture I showed you of the ship in the pack ice, The Botany of the Antarctic Voyage. 11 years in the making, 6 huge volumes, half of them full of illustrations like the one I showed you. This is how Hooker makes his reputation, by describing in enormous detail the things he's seen and the things he's collected. Except, of course, he hasn't seen or collected most of the things that he describes. He's been in Tasmania for 3 months. The most diligent and hard-working botanist cannot survey a country's vegetation in 3 months. He's been in New Zealand for about the same time. He publishes a book on that, same problem. So how does he do it? How does he write the books that build up his reputation? How does he collect the specimens? And the answer, of course, is letter writing. And he writes to colonial collectors. These are just a handful of the people that I've identified who collected for him. These happen to be the ones of whom I found pictures. You can see the gentleman second from the left there is Gunn, the man after whom that eucalypt is named. The one second from the right is Kenzo, who I'm going to come on to in a second. But there are at least 34 of these people I've identified so far just for the Australia and New Zealand collections. And without them, Hooker couldn't have written his books, couldn't have made his reputation, couldn't have become director of Kew. So I want to look a little bit at New Zealand. This is a painting of the Erebus and Terror arriving in the Bay of Islands on the North Island of New Zealand, Maori in their war canoes coming out to meet them. The Beagle was here just a decade or so earlier, and Darwin set foot on the same beach that Hooker is going to, and he met the same person, this man, the Reverend William Kenzo. Kenzo was a Cornishman originally, apprenticed as a printer, and then he becomes a very devout Christian and joins the Church Missionary Society, and he's sent off to New Zealand to work for the Missionary Society and to use his printing skills in particular. He becomes an expert on the Maori language. The most important job that they have for him is to actually translate the Bible into Maori and print the Bible in Maori so that they can convert the indigenous people. This is an example of his printing. As you can see, starting at the top here, ko te pukapaka o te waka pokorahu o hihu karete, te tama arawiri, te tama aparahama. And if your Maori is a little rusty, I'll translate for you. The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. This is the beginning of the gospel according to Matthew. These are the begats, the genealogy of Christ. What the Maori made of this, I have no idea. History does not recall. But this was very important to Kenzo, that he had the only printing press in the country, and he's one of the people who invent written Maori. The Maori have no written language until contact with Europeans. And the standard forms that are still used by Maori today are actually devised by the missionaries, and Kenzo is one of the people who helps to standardize and establish them. I find Kenzo a fascinating figure, and I have to always restrain myself when I start talking about him because I could easily go on for an hour or two just on Kenzo. So if I'm still talking about him in 10 minutes, you can throw something heavy at me and I'll stop, okay? But because he has the only printing press, he's asked to produce the Maori text of the Treaty of Waitangi, the treaty the British sign with the Maori taking control of New Zealand as a colony. And at the time, in the 1840s, Kenzo complains that the Maori don't know what they're signing. And he says there is no Maori word that corresponds to the idea of sovereignty. The Maori think they are electing Queen Victoria as a kind of paramount chief, a sort of first among equals of the Maori. The idea they're giving the country away to the foreigners is simply not thinkable in their cosmos. And of course his protests are ignored. But he later publishes his first-hand account of this, and Maori scholars today who are still fighting for land rights in New Zealand regard him as one of the best accounts by a white person of what happened at the time. So he has a very interesting history. He's also fascinating. The very first letter I ever read from him, I saw his name in one of Hooker's books, and I went to look him up in the archives at Kew and pick up a letter at random, and it says, "My dear Hooker, the bishop came to tea the other evening, bringing another bishop with him. Picture it. There's me, an excommunicated Darwinian, entertaining 2 bishops to tea." And I read this and thought, nobody was excommunicated for being a Darwinian, even in New Zealand, as far as I know. And I didn't know anything about him at this stage. I went and looked him up and did some research, and he wasn't excommunicated. His license to preach was suspended. His license to preach was suspended because he got his teenage Maori servant pregnant, and his wife left him, taking their children with him. And as he had spent some years going around the North Island telling the Maori to stop sinning, this made him something of a ridiculous figure in their eyes, and the church decided they could do without his services for a year or two. What this has to do with Darwinism is anyone's guess, but certainly Kenzo's love of the Maori was quite practical, as well as having its kind of intellectual aspects. The thing that made Kenzo a difficult character for Hooker was that he saw himself as a serious botanist. This was a great asset in many ways. He was well educated, he really knew the plants, he travelled very widely, he knew the Maori, their language, what they did with the plants and so on. But the question was that he always wanted to name New Zealand's plants himself, to do the classification in New Zealand. Hooker wasn't having this. Hooker had this great worry that people were naming plants all over the empire and giving new names to plants that had already been named. And unless you had a huge collection like Kew and a big library, and you could make the proper comparisons with known species, you were going to just pile up what are called synonyms, duplicate names, that just render the whole business of botany completely confusing. So Hooker had to kind of endlessly rein in Kenzo's desire to do this naming himself. But he did help Kenzo to join the leading European scientific societies, so he went out of his way to be as friendly and helpful as he could while denying him the thing he wanted most. And one of the ways that this relationship works, if you read the letters, is through gift giving. This is a vasculum, a tin box which is used to put freshly picked plants into so you can take them home and press them. This belonged to Joseph Hooker. He took it on the Erebus voyage with him, and he gave it to Kenzo as a present, a souvenir of their time together. This is another example. This is a microscope which Kenzo actually bought, but you couldn't buy microscopes in New Zealand, and he ordered catalogues from Britain and was completely confused by the diversity of models and makes and prices and so on. So he asked Hooker to do it for him, and this is another kind of gift. Hooker used his time and expertise to choose the right instrument for Kenzo, and the fact that it's still there in the Hawke's Bay Museum is evidence of how treasured a possession it was. But these exchanges of gifts, and of course naming species after your collectors and so on, are all very important in keeping this very informal relationship going. Because the most important thing about the relationship is that Kenzo was never paid for anything he did. None of the collectors were paid. And they weren't paid for the very simple reason that Joseph Hooker couldn't afford to pay them. But luckily for him, they would have refused payment even if it had been offered, because they saw science as a vocation, as something you did for love of God, for love of empire, for love of knowledge in its own right, and often actually for love of Hooker as a friend. And that was incredibly valuable to Hooker at a time when he didn't have a steady income, and as I say, he couldn't have paid them even if they'd wanted payment. But that actually puts Hooker in a slightly strange position relative to his collectors, because of course he does need to work for money. They can see themselves as disinterested gentlemen, as people actually rather like Darwin and Banks doing science for love, because actually they earn their living as missionaries or doing the other things that they do. Hooker has to work at science, and it's not quite clear that working at science is a respectable thing to do at this time. The gentlemanly ideal, the disinterested ideal, is still the dominant one. So, although Hooker is carving out a profession as a scientific man, it's an awkward position to be in. And there's a delicate negotiation between him and his collectors over these issues of status, of expertise, of who is in charge, of who is actually the kind of dominant figure here. Because in some ways they, as gentlemanly amateurs, have a higher standing than he does. Though, of course, he has a better education, he has access to distinguished friends and publications and so on. But this isn't a straightforward relationship. It's a product of endless, delicate negotiation. And the giving and receiving of gifts, plants, books, pictures and so on, is an important way of keeping that relationship going. The ultimate gift which Kenzo receives is that the Flora of New Zealand is dedicated to him. And this is no small honour. The first volume of the Botany of the Antarctic Voyage, the Flora Antarctica, is dedicated to Queen Victoria. So it's pretty good company to be in. And the other two gentlemen named here are Andrew Sinclair, another New Zealand naturalist, and David Lyle, who is Hooker's counterpart on HMS Terror, another naval surgeon. So these are the collectors, the people who made the work possible, being thanked in the most important way possible by Hooker for their contribution. Let me turn back to Darwin, and let me talk a little bit about the private lives of Hooker and Darwin quickly. Darwin and Hooker become friends because of the voyage. When Hooker gets back, his feats in the Antarctic are quite well known. Darwin writes to him, offering him some of the plants for the Galapagos for his big southern floras, and they become close friends. And they write, as I say, more than 1,300 surviving letters over the course of the rest of Darwin's life. They also, they both get married. So Darwin marries his cousin, Emma Darwin, who is an industrial heiress, part of the Wedgwood family. She brings a substantial fortune to augment the money that he's already got. Joseph, as I say, is not quite so lucky. He wants to marry Frances Henslow, who, interestingly, is the daughter of Darwin's old botany professor, John Stevens Henslow from Cambridge. So they're very close, these families. As I say, Hooker wants to marry her, but he still, at this stage, at the end of the 1840s, doesn't have a regular job. He doesn't have a steady income. And so he has to put off marriage and go off on yet another voyage of exploration, the one I mentioned earlier, to India. This is a scene from his diary of his travels, and the hut in the front there is where he and his companion were briefly imprisoned by the Rajah of Sikkim because they had deliberately and consciously disobeyed the Rajah's explicit order not to cross the border into Tibet. And the Rajah regarded them as British spies, which, given that Hooker's maps of India were actually used by the British Army later, is not a totally unreasonable assumption. But it was a kind of a nerve-wracking few years. I imagine Frances must have been on particularly anxious, waiting to hear news of her imprisoned fiancé and so on. He gets out, he gets home safely. But while he's in India, Darwin writes to him to tell him that Emma had lately produced our fourth boy and seventh child, a precious lot of young beggars we are rearing. I was very bold and administered myself, before the doctor came, chloroform to my wife, with admirable success. When Hooker marries, he gets back from India, finally gets the job at Kew, and when their second child, Harriet Ann, is born, Darwin writes to ask him, "Did you administer the chloroform? When I did, I was perfectly convinced that the chloroform was very composing to oneself, as well as to the patient." Recall that Darwin hated the sight of operations being done, and the sight of his wife in agony was almost unbearable to him. In fact, he was so anxious to spare Emma any pain that he almost knocked the poor woman unconscious, which must have made giving birth really, really difficult, especially as she had 10 children. But it's interesting to see Darwin and Hooker at the bedsides of their wives while they're giving birth. It's not the image one has of the Victorian father, the Victorian gentleman. This is Hooker writing back. "I did give the chloroform as before, and with the best effect, though the doctor was horribly prejudiced against it. And he, having delivered 3,000 or 4,000 women without it, that is perhaps not to be wondered at." Actually, chloroform is quite controversial. It's used in childbirth at this time. It's actually considered, this may sound ludicrous, but it's actually considered immoral by some doctors. Women are supposed to be in agony when they're giving birth. That is because Eve sinned and led us all into the fall. Therefore, every woman has to pay the price. Okay? So anesthesia is an absolute violation of God's will for women. Things have improved in some ways when we look back, I think. But the presence of men at the bedside is perhaps more surprising, not as surprising as it looks. Obviously, poor men had very often been at their wives' bedsides because there was no one else to help. But the presence of educated middle-class men was actually beginning to be fairly common in the mid-Victorian period. So Prince Albert was actually with Victoria when she gave birth. And it's interesting that the press at the time praised him for being an up-to-date modern father and husband. So it's a nice kind of insight into the letters give you a view into Victorian fatherhood, which is a little different from the kind of stereotypes of the stern, remote Victorian patriarch who couldn't even remember their children's names, you know. Fairly hands-on fathers. And you see that even more Before Hooker is married and has his own children, he's a regular visitor to Darwin's home. And from one of the letters, you get a sense of what he was doing when he wasn't talking about science. When Hooker sent the Darwin family a cake to thank them for their hospitality, Darwin told him his daughter Annie had wanted to know whether it had come from the gentleman what played with us so. So Hooker really liked playing with children, and he carried on doing this all his life. There's kind of a nice story. This is him, as I mentioned before, as a rather lackadaisical young man. Being, of course, a serious Victorian paterfamilias and man of science, he has to grow a beard. And as he gets older, the beard gets more and more and more extreme and ridiculous. And in the middle period, when he's in what I think of as his old sheep phase, Francis dies and he remarries and has 2 further children when he's in his 60s. And one of the visitors to their house, one of the botanists from Kew, recalled that they had a favourite game he would play with his son. He was 69, I think, when his son was born. And Hooker would take his beard and wrap it round and clench it in his upper lip and come roaring out from under the dining table, being a lion. And he and his he and his son always wrote to each other as old and young lion, or old lion and cub, in their letters for the rest of Hooker's life. So this playfulness was a very important feature of his work. And again, the letters give you these interesting connections that you might not otherwise see. Unfortunately, of course, life for a Victorian parent wasn't all playing with children. And in September 1863, Hooker writes to Darwin that, "Dear, dear friend, my darling little second girl died here an hour ago, and I think of you more in my grief than of any other friend." Maria Elizabeth was 6 years old. I have a 6-year-old child, and I find these letters incredibly poignant when I read them, thinking what this must have been like. He says, "I think of Darwin." Why does he think of Darwin more than anyone else? Well, because, of course, Darwin had lost several of his children in infancy. It's important to remember the Darwins are wealthy, educated, middle-class people with the best medical care money can buy. They lose 3 of their 10 children in childhood. Victorian children are about 25 times as likely to die in childhood as our children are. And Annie's death got to Charles Darwin incredibly deeply. I mean, it hurt him even more than the others, because she was, as you can see here, 10 years old. And you basically assumed once your child had got to about 5 or 6 years old, they were safe. Most of the deaths happened in the first couple of years. So by 10 years old, you think you're safe, but not Annie, sadly. It was a devastating blow for Darwin. And he and Hooker write quite a lot about the loss of their children and how they feel about it. So Hooker writes back to Darwin a little while later, "Dear old Darwin, I've just buried my darling little girl and read your kind note. I tried hard to make no difference between her and the other children, but she was my very own, the flower of my flock in everyone's eyes, the companion of my walks, the first of my children who has shown any love for music and flowers, and the sweetest-tempered, affectionate little thing that ever I knew. It will be long before I cease to hear her voice in my ears or feel her little hand stealing into mine. By the fireside and in the garden, wherever I go, she is there." You think about a man whose entire life revolves around a garden and flowers. This is the flower of his flock, the first of his children to show any love for flowers. It must have been unbearable every time he walked outside. He did, however, express some relief that she had suffered comparatively little, and, he added, "Above all do I rejoice that she was yet so young and happy that death did not enter her little head during her illness." And Darwin writes back, "I understand well your words, wherever I go she is there. I am so deeply glad that she did not suffer so much, as I feared was inevitable. This was to us with poor Annie the one great comfort. Trust to me that time will do wonders, and without causing forgetfulness of your darling." The one great comfort is an interesting phrase here, because, of course, for most people in Britain in the first half of the 19th century, the one great comfort was to be found in religion, in the consolation that your child was with God, was no longer suffering, had been released from their earthly toils. You don't find that in Darwin and Hooker's letters. But you do find echoes of this same language of consolation in Darwin's published writings, in The Origin of Species itself. And it's worth dwelling briefly on this language in which he expresses himself. When we reflect on this struggle, the struggle for existence, we may console ourselves with the full belief that the war of nature is not incessant, that no fear is felt, that death is generally prompt, and that the vigorous, the healthy, and the happy survive and multiply. This, of course, doesn't give you an explanation or consolation of an individual life or its end, but death is generally prompt. There's a kind of statistical comfort to be derived from this. And you see this even more clearly in the conclusion to The Origin of Species. I imagine this passage is very well known to most people here. But Darwin ends the book by saying, "From the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is a grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." And that notion that from this apparently senseless suffering, from war, from famine, from the extinction of multiple species, from the deaths of individuals, children, animals, plants, we see a hope of some kind of progress. Many of Darwin's readers take the book that way, and they do find a consolation. Of course, this is not a traditional Christian consolation or anything like it, but for people who are having trouble accepting the traditional Christian consolation, this was actually, the idea of progress was actually a substitute for many people. And I think it was for Darwin personally, to some degree. I'm going to wrap this up, you'll be delighted to hear, by telling you a little bit about what happened next, what happened to our cast of characters. Joe here in his old sheep phase. In 1873, the Gardener's Chronicle, which, despite its title, is a very important scientific publication at the time, reported that Hooker had been elected President of the Royal Society. An election that was, the paper commented, peculiarly gratifying to botanists and horticulturalists. It is many years since the throne of science has been occupied by a naturalist. We believe not since the time of Sir Joseph Banks. Through the work that he'd done, through the classification of plants, the books that he'd published, the collections he's amassed, Hooker had actually become the successor to Banks in a very literal sense. He was indeed the first botanist to be president of the Royal Society since Banks's day. And he'd got there by a very different route, not by being massively wealthy and being able to buy his way into the King's favour and onto Cook's voyage, but by working very hard as a naval surgeon and then as a public servant, in effect, at Kew, doing this very hard graft, maintaining these relationships with the Kenzos of the world, amassing these collections of plants, publishing these huge catalogues of the plants of the world. And he was knighted, he became Knight Commander of the Star of India and then Grand Commander for his services to empire, because under him Kew continued this very important work of transplanting economically valuable plants to the colonies where they could be exploited for increased profit. So here are three old men towards the end of their days. We all know what happens to Darwin, or perhaps we don't. Darwin ends up buried in Westminster Abbey, the headquarters of the Anglican Church in Britain. He had become, by the end of his life, a sufficiently respectable figure that the church felt they needed him to be lying just alongside Sir Isaac Newton. On the right is Joseph Hooker in old age. He lived till 1911. He outlived Darwin by many decades. And he always planned that he was going to write a kind of big philosophical treatise on botany, on a Darwinian botany book, as he put it. He never got round to it. When he retired, he spent his life reclassifying the genus Impatiens, the balsam family, and he finished his last paper on the classification of that group about a fortnight before he died, sorting out the species, naming them, working out what their actual classificatory system should be. It occupied his entire life. He never got round to stepping back and speculating about what it all meant. And in the middle is William Kenzo, who lived till 1899. The thing I find quite moving about Kenzo's letters to Hooker in later years is that they keep writing. Long after Hooker has finished working actively on New Zealand plants, he has nothing to gain from this relationship anymore, but they still write to each other. And this hand-tinted photo was a present that Kenzo sent to Hooker in his old age as a memento of their lifelong friendship, which I think was a very real friendship. The letters towards the end of his life are kind of great. There's only one every 6 or 9 months. And the first one I read, Kenzo finishes by saying, my health is generally good. I can still read without glasses as long as the light is good. And then 6 months later he writes, my health is generally quite good. I can still read without glasses as long as the light is good. And 6 months later I think, yes, and your memory's going, but you haven't noticed that. But the warmth of these relationships, and I think the genuine human qualities that underpin them, writing about children and families, writing about Darwin and Hooker, write about the novels that they read, about the holidays they took with their wives and children. Of course, the letters are dominated by scientific debates and often sharp disagreements between them on important issues. But understanding these networks is absolutely crucial to understanding the way that Victorian science actually worked. Because without this scattered collection of people, the Clenzos of the world, Kenzo is also important to Darwin. He answers his questionnaire for the Expression of the Emotions book that Darwin does later, writing about the Maori and their facial expressions and so on. So he's directly in touch with Darwin in later years too. But without all these people who were not paid, people like Hooker and Darwin could never have had the kind of big, grand, metropolitan scientific careers that they had. They would never have been able to build institutions like Kew and the British Museum, these kind of big, dominant institutions which are still vital to scientific work today. And above all, books like The Origin of Species could never have been written, because The Origin of Species is above all a compendium of a vast amount of evidence assembled from all over the world by a vast network of collectors and correspondents. And I'll leave you finally just with this thought, that without the British Empire, that network wouldn't have been there. This is the way the empire looked just after Darwin's death, the biggest empire the world had ever seen at that point. Now, of course, The Origin of Species doesn't justify the empire. I'm not for one moment going to go there. But it is just a fact that it's one of the things that helps us to understand why Darwin was able to do what he did when he did it. He had a whole range of resources at his disposal that earlier evolutionary thinkers, and there were plenty of them, had not had. And it was the combination of all these people, missionaries and administrators, soldiers and sailors, convict overseers, a whole mass of people, traders, merchants. They were all there because they were working for the empire in some form or other, directly or indirectly. They were taking advantage of the opportunities that the empire had opened up. And of course, because the empire was there was a vast communication network. Ships were backwards and forwards carrying letters, carrying seeds, carrying information, and tying the empire together, sending out orders, bringing home exploitable resources and so on. But they made the letters between the Hookers, the Clenzos, the Darwins, and all of their friends and connections possible. So those are the connections between Darwin, Hooker, and empire. Thank you very much for listening.